remembers the movie Who Framed Roger Rabbit? You remember that movie? One of the iconic characters in that movie is Jessica Rabbit, and her tagline was, "I'm not bad, I'm just drawn that way." We all remember that line. It resonates with me because of the topic that we're talking about today, and I thought, embracing diversity in divisive times. I prefer to just say embracing diversity. And to use or to paraphrase Jessica Rabbit, diversity programs aren't bad. They're just drawn that way sometimes. So I'm here to talk to you about ways that maybe we can draw them better, ways that we can design them so that they are more effective, and rather than creating division, actually create unity. And how about this? Actually create some positive business results. So I'm going to guide you through some comparing and contrasting of things that I think we've done well in the world of diversity, some things we've done not so well, and then hopefully give you some tips that'll help you do them better. So let's start out with one thing that we've done well, but then maybe not so well. So it's hard to imagine that 60 years ago, decades before I was born, it was actually okay for somebody to say to someone who looked like me, I'd love to hire you, but I really think women should be at home having babies. Or, I just don't like people like you, where you came from, where you were born, etc. It's hard to believe that that was actually lawful 60 years ago. So I think everyone in this room would agree that something that we've done well when it comes to diversity is we passed laws that prohibit that kind of behavior. Civil rights laws at a federal level and at a state level is something that we did well. But there's been consequences to it, and there's at least two that I think have really impacted diversity in the workplace. One is that while laws are very helpful, they don't solve the problem. These are societal issues that have much deeper roots. And so as you see from these statistics, it's not like there aren't any more lawsuits. It's not like suddenly discriminatory behavior stops. It's just one way of handling it. The other consequence is that we've provided very little avenues for employees. Many employees who feel unfairly treated in the workplace think that there are two options: sue my employer or leave and go somewhere else. Those aren't very good choices, and we need to create better choices. The last thing that I think it's done, and it's really at the root, certainly, of my practice, and that is that we've become obsessed with compliance. We want to make sure that we are complying with the law, and in doing so, we forget that there's a bigger picture and a bigger reason for having diversity initiatives. And in fact, sometimes it has the opposite effect. There's lots of social sciences that shows that when we actually do things simply to comply with the law and do so in an ineffective way, not only does it not help the issue, it actually has a backlash effect and causes division. So that's one little historical fact. The other one is a little broader: diversity. We have generally, as corporate America, embraced the issue of diversity, knowing that it does have some very positive business consequences. Unfortunately, though, sometimes those initiatives have been implemented in not the best way. So they have created and actually caused more division than unity. It creates an us versus them mentality if done wrong. If you force something down someone's throat and say, this is the way that you're going to think, you're going to be tolerant in this way, they end up oftentimes having the opposite effect of creating the unity that is really at the core of diversity. One last thing that we've done well, but then not so well: we've implemented great training programs. And in fact, one of the speakers earlier today alluded to this report that I, of course, am a nerd, so I read cover to cover the EEOC report that the Special Task Force on Harassment released last year. And this was one of the most important quotes, I thought. It said, we looked at the efficacy of training, of harassment training and diversity training, and it's good when done well. But when it's done poorly, not only is it not good, again, it actually is counterproductive and creates the backlash that I was talking about earlier. So you can see that even some of the areas in which we've implemented programs or done things that can work well for the workplace, the flip side of it is not always so good. So the question now is, what can we do better? So I'm going to walk you through a couple of tips that, in my experience, implementing diversity programs, looking at the issue of diversity in the workplace, have worked well for me. The first is that even the use of the terminology, diversity, inclusion, unfortunately, even though the dictionary definitions are very, very clear, they've now become very charged terms, very political terms. And so one of the things that I do when I work with my clients is we actually work sometimes with corporate communications, with PR, with marketing, and we come up with different ways of talking about diversity initiatives. Here are some ideas. Perhaps instead of saying diversity inclusion, you might say stronger together, building bridges, we are one team. Something that really promotes this idea that what we're trying to get to is unity, getting together so that we can actually be a better team rather than division. Now, that's not to say that you're not going to promote the issues that are related to the core of what the diversity efforts are, but you're at least planting the seed from the very beginning that your goal is to actually unify people in the workplace. So that's one tip. Something else that you need to do is we're not very good at providing our employees with tools on how to communicate and on how to talk about some of these issues. Something that I see a lot of in the diversity field is that we've also become so nervous about talking to each other, and we've made it almost taboo to talk about topics such as culture, religion, language. We don't want to talk about it because we're scared. One person might think that I'm going to be offensive, they're going to get mad at me, and so again, rather than creating unity, it's creating division. So one tool, a very simple one that I know I've used in my practice, and to be honest with you, I've used in my own personal life. Like probably everyone in this room, I had a strong reaction to the political cycle. And one of the things that I realized was that most of us look at the person with whom we're speaking, and our first thought is, what can I do to change that person's mind? And with that thought, you've already lost the battle to having a good conversation. The goal shouldn't be that. The goal should be, what can I do to make this person perhaps understand my point of view better? And that's advice that I think you can and should give to your employees. Now, a lot of us might say, well, if we just tell them that they can't talk about politics, or they can, but they need to do so in a way that isn't harassing, well, sure, that's fine, but that doesn't really provide them with any substantive tools on how to do it. So later you're going to hear from my colleague Dennis, who's a real psychologist. I only play one on TV. And he's going to give you even more tips on communication. But I do think that providing tools. Another tool that I use quite a bit is when you tell stories, when you give anecdotes about successful diversity initiatives. Here's one that I use a lot. It's not from my practice. It's actually a story I heard on NPR, but it's a fabulous story. It's from the Silicon Valley. It's about a company that's a high-tech company that specializes in making technology products for older Americans. And they hired an intern from the local retirement home who was in her 90s. She had been a career inventor. And she told this story about sitting in a product development meeting where they were pitching a product that included a tiny battery that needed to be changed pretty often. She raised her hand and said, "You understand that old people do not have the manual dexterity to be able to change that size of a battery." And the 20-something-year-olds around the room said, "What are you talking about? Why couldn't you do that?" They then interviewed the CEO of the company, who said, had it not been for that interaction, we would have put out a product that would have been a complete failure because we didn't really understand our target market. So another tool is I use that story because I think it gets to the heart of the business reasons for having diversity, but it's also an example that's not threatening to anybody. We're not talking about issues, again, that cause division. People understand what the topic is in that particular example. The final piece of advice that I have is that if the idea is to create unity rather than division, then one of the things that we can do is to affirmatively do things to create connections between our employees. I mean, it sounds so cliche, but the better we know each other, the more we appreciate where we come from, why we think the way we do, the better we're going to get along, the better team we're going to be. So one thing that I use in my training sessions is a tactic where I ask employees who are going to be at a meeting to bring with them images, pictures from outside of their work life, to tell us a little bit about who they are. And I ask them to do a couple of things. First, bring something that is meaningful, that really, really gets to the heart of who you are. But then do two other things. Pick some images that maybe are kind of stereotypical, things that you would expect people to think about you, but some that aren't, some that might be a little bit of a surprise. So I'll end today with a truncated version of what that presentation would be for me. So we'll start out with the obvious. For any of you who attended the TED Talks last year, you'll remember that I was born in this tiny country in Central America, El Salvador. So you look at me, you see my last name. The fact that I'm Latina is not surprising. But you hear me talk without an accent, you know that I'm a lawyer, and most people don't automatically think that I'm an immigrant who was born outside of the United States. So immediately you know a little bit more about me that maybe you wouldn't have expected. It's also expected that my family, as a Latina, is the most important thing in my life. That's certainly something that's stereotypical. In fact, this picture, which is literally my big fat Salvadoran wedding, because it is at my rehearsal dinner the night before my wedding a few years ago, and it really just encapsulates my culture, my love of family, and in this case, my love of my blended family. I was telling a story earlier that my stepdaughter, who is mostly of Italian descent, said to me, well, you know, I'm Salvadoran now. I mean, she's really embraced the cultural components of my family. And I call us the big fat Salvadoran wedding, this photo at least, because that really is my life. If you remember the character of Gus, and again, if you attended my tech talk last year, my father was the Salvadoran version of Gus. And both my husband and my son will tell you that the other thing that is very much we have in common with that movie is if you just replace Windex with what we call in my house Vicks Vaporub, otherwise known as Vicks Vapor Rub, that is the cure-all for everything in a Salvadoran household, from a pimple to, you know, a fever to everything in between. So very similar to the events in that movie. So that's one thing about me that I think, you know, might connect with some people. Another thing about me, I'm devoutly Catholic. I put these pictures up for a very specific reason. First of all, these are my personal photos, actually taken from my iPhone last Ash Wednesday at the Vatican. I was on a Catholic pilgrimage with my husband. These were actually taken by him because I was trying to soak in the moment of meeting one of my absolute heroes on earth. But I put this on here, number one, because I talked earlier about how we have made taboo certain subjects in the workplace. They don't need to be. I'm not here to try to convert anyone. I'm not here to try to tell you that my religion is better than any other. But if I gave a talk and didn't tell you that this is a core part of me, I would be inauthentic. Catholicism is at the core of who I am. So it's not taboo. It doesn't have to be an uncomfortable topic. I love to answer questions about my Catholic faith. And again, it might be something that I can connect with people, whether they're Catholic or not. Maybe they're of a different religion, but we have an equal level of faith and it's an equal level of importance. The other reason I put it up is that, frankly, it starts to confuse people. When we talk about politics, people have a stereotype in their mind of what my political views might be because of my ethnicity, my gender, my immigrant status, and the fact that I live in California. But if you also know that I'm a devout Catholic, I'm suddenly not so one-dimensional. I actually am interesting. I have a lot of different viewpoints. So I wanted to put my money where my mouth is. I'm a voracious reader, and I'm extremely curious. And one of the things that I thought during the election cycle was there is an entire demographic in the United States that I frankly know almost nothing about. I haven't lived in Appalachia. I really don't know people in that area. And one of the things that I wanted to do, if I'm really going to be true to my commitment to have people try to understand me, is that I need to understand them as well. I highly recommend this book, The Hillbilly Elegy. It was written by a gentleman who grew up in Appalachia and who went on to go to Yale Law School. His upbringing could not be more different from mine, and yet I find myself reading this and nodding my head sometimes, understanding what he's explaining. So, you know, another thing that I think says a little bit about me. So I'm going to move on to the last topics, which in my case is my absolute love of music. It's a huge, huge part of my life. And it's something I go to concerts a lot. My iPad is filled with very eclectic music. But the next slide is going to be probably the surprise one. So I'm Salvadoran. I grew up in South Central Los Angeles. My formative years were in the 1980s. So of course, my favorite band is, who knows who this is? Let's just say that when Hotel California won yesterday, I was a happy gal. The Eagles are my favorite band. I don't know why. I love them. I love, love, love the Eagles. And somebody offered to karaoke Hotel California with me, but I'm a one of these nights. I prefer that song, so we can do that one. But this is something when I tell people that this is my favorite band, people are shocked because it does not match with what you think I might be. The final one, again, in music is my latest obsession. and that is Hamilton the musical. I've seen it live twice. I just took my son last week to see it in New York. I'm obsessed with it, with the soundtrack, with the book. And I end with this one because I'm particularly intrigued by this quote by Lin-Manuel Miranda. He says that when he was writing Hamilton, he was writing about America then, but telling the story with America now. Now, in the context of the musical, that means that it's a multiracial cast, the music is much more contemporary. But what I like about the quote is, what he also means is, he's not losing the essence of the story of this very important founding father and other founding fathers. The story didn't change, just the way in which he told it has changed. And I thought that really matches with what I'm trying to say today. The essence of diversity, or stronger together, or unity, or whatever you want to call it, should remain the same. But what we need to do is tell it in a way that resonates with our audience today. Thank you.